as the last name is. I've got an interesting story for that. So if you guys want to know, look me up after the speech. So really, one of the key things I think I wanted to talk more over here about is not really talk as a presentation, but I would like this to be more of an engagement and a discussion about what really are our metrics and what is reporting in general, right? As a tester throughout my career, I've always had the BAs come up to me, project managers come up to me, the CEOs and CTOs come up and say, hey, can we go live? Where are your metrics? How can I decide? How can I define if we are good to go? You are the gatekeeper for quality. And that sort of put a lot of pressure on me as a tester. And like, oh my God, am I looking at everything? Have I done everything right? My leads, my managers would come up and say, okay, give me this information. I need this number now. Stop testing and go get this information from me, right? So I started thinking about a lot of, what are they really talking about? What is a report? What are metrics? How are they so important, and what can be deciphered out of them that, I'm not, for some reason, understanding? What are the reasons for collecting it? How does that whole cycle behave? What do I need to look for? Things of that nature. And then how do we really establish or define, oh yes, this is a good set of a metric that works for my organization or my team or any of that, right? So that's sort of what I wanted to just go over and sort of use that as a refresher for myself, but also to share that with fellow testers who want to know that information. So please stop me at any point and let's make this a discussion. I think that would be more engaging for all of us to talk about new ideas. So obviously, when I wanted to look at what the definition of a report is, I went to Wikipedia, right? And a report
let me say it this way. I've gone into a number of organizations over the years that have taken over troubled implementations to turn them around. And the first thing that I fix is reporting. It's the absolute first thing that I fix. Why? Because there's confusion on the team, right? What are we trying to do? How will we know when we are done, right? And you try to simplify as quickly as you can from a reporting framework the answer to those two questions. What are we doing here, and how are we going to know when we're done, right?
Absolutely.
Then when you think about the items that you brought up, I mean, there's a certain amount of product quality that, if you're doing a software implementation, are we doing an implementation that's going to work for us in this business context? Do we have an appropriate understanding of the business risk of the requirements? And over on the tech spec side, do we have an appreciation of the technical complexity related to those requirements? Because in a lot of ways, you can unpack very quickly what your risk assessment is. I mean, why do we test? Right, to mitigate risk, right? And the risk that we want to mitigate the most is public failure, right? And so we don't want to see any of that. So we run this stuff through our test environments in order to manage that risk down. It never really goes away, but we can manage it down to an acceptable level, right? So I will look at reports on what is the risk, how far have we gone in our testing to mitigate that risk on both the business customer side and from the technology side. When I think about the process, though, of testing in general, right, and to your point, driving efficiency, if I'm trying to build a high-performance testing team, then I would want to see that our ability to communicate at the handoffs is getting better and better over time, right? So I would want to measure things like the time that a defect is found in test and then handed off correctly, solidly to rework in the development cycle, and then what's that lag from the rework, right, back. And so everywhere, like in a system, where there's an interface, is where I'm most likely to have opportunity for improvement.
Sure. So you're looking at it almost at a granular level of sort of a defect agent, right? Where as you hand off to a different role, is that where you're going with that, or are you thinking
that's
more
a
about
part of it? Because what you'll also see is, typically QA takes a lot of hits because
Always.
we get the code late, but then we're supposed to restore the project to its original schedule, right? So we're going to truncate our testing.
See pretty much everybody nodding.
And move it back, and all we need from you, sir, is for you to just, test as fast as you can and don't find any defects, right?
Don't find any
Then we'll be on
critical
schedule and we can go live.
Not only hand off from QA, but to QA. We
Yeah.
need to know when, if you're in a sprint, if a story's done, something needs to ring a bell.
Yes, and see,
let us know to start testing.
what's also interesting is the perception of what a lot of people think sprints and agile is, right? They think just because you have the ability to change, right, which is what the main message is, that you can be dynamic within a sprint, people misinterpret that to say, oh, I can change this on the nth day before you go live, without understanding the risk, which is the point. And I think as I've done a lot of these projects or involved with these bad experiences, what I've realized is our naming convention, like we are quality assurance. If you think about it, we cannot assure it, right? Like you said, we can only mitigate and point the risk. The decision-making process has to be the business stakeholder. Our function is to show them all of the risk factors and say, if you go live, here's what might happen, right? And I think that's the mindset. I think we have to make sure we educate people who are not testers to understand that, if you minimize the time, right? So a lot of time, like you said, you originally planned for 2 weeks of testing. It's down to 4 days. Can you get everything done? Of course not. They expect you to say yes, but then the risk assessment comes in, right? What are we looking for? And that's where communication, to your point, understanding the impacts of change, and that communication has to be very strong. Absolutely. Yes.
And then, like I said too, you've got to make a distinction about, in my reporting, I'm reporting out against the test plan. So back to Ramon's point, right? If I've got a test plan, I've got requirements, and all I'm doing is really saying it either meets or doesn't meet the requirements. How many requirements have I tunneled through, and where am I at? When am I going to be done, right? Then there's the defect reports, right, with some analysis on the defects that says, and here's how long it's going to take to fix those in order for us to get back into test, right? So you got to think about this reporting as an opportunity to improve communication,
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
Where are we really at, and
Absolutely.
when will we really be done?
So on the note of defect reporting, and this is more of a question, I think more as testers, how many people actually use severity and priority, or one or the other? And do you guys know what the difference is? Very basic question, I guess, but do we understand as a team, as testers, what the distinction is? Severity is completely different than priority, right?
Yes.
A severity for a misspelled word is a low severity as a tester, but it's the #1 priority for the business if it's the company logo. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I've seen, it sounds so easy and basic to understand, but you'd be surprised at how many people use that term interchangeably.
And importance. Importance. If you have your company name misspelled on the header,
Yeah.
that's not critical. You can still maneuver and test everything else.
Exactly. So it's not critical
But
at all.
it makes you look like an idiot to the customer, so it's very
High
important.
priority. Exactly. So I usually say priority is business to put it at the #1 to fix. Right?
One of the things that we have done is kind of like, in a lot of our projects, we gave it the definition of this reporting that we're talking, static versus dynamic, right? And I think like that helped a lot of people because static was maybe, reporting, okay,
Yeah.
in kind of like abstract terms. But from a dynamic perspective, we made it like target oriented.
Yeah. So dashboards versus
Correct.
here's a snapshot. Right?
And that really helped a lot because people could really see. And then it led the conversation immediately to your previous point about the risk taking.
Sure.
So there is no situation like zero defects and all. It's all about, like, if you know what's going on and you have your arms around the problem.
Yeah, and I think the key over there is I can test with a lot of variations that I can catch only this given my time. Right? So I cannot guarantee a defect-free product. I mean, it's I don't think we can stand behind that and say, oh, this product going out the door is 100% defect. For software, I believe this. So interesting discussion. I think it fits right into this, right? So looking at the process of how we as a team or as testers define metrics, right? The key thing is an initial definition and prioritization, right? What from a delivery perspective, what are your objectives as a team working on a product, right? The key thing over there is to identify and define what those important things are. What's important to your stakeholder, right? Do they care about when you finish testing versus how many critical issues exist? What is their priorities? And this varies based on organization, based on the context of the project, and so forth and so on. I've worked on projects where we've had 3 key things that I think a lot of people want. They want to know about overall product quality, right? How is the quality stack up with the defects and things of that. But they also want to look at it from a timelines perspective, right? Did you finish on time? Did you start on time? What were the challenges there? And then if you have a team that is on contract or has some sort of an SLA, then you want to look at their productivity / utilization. So if you think of it as 3 major buckets, right? If you are looking for reports that help you start with those, I mean, you can go to Sticky Minds or just Google, right? You'll find tons of templates that people have put there, want to share. But what's important is take some sort of a base and then work your way through sort of this life cycle that has helped me in the past to really understand and define what my stakeholders want to get out of any sort of reporting, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's static. What are they really looking for to be able to make the right kind of decisions and triggers to make sure that things are moving along as expected, right? So defining and prioritizing what you want to report on, right? Identifying what data you want to capture, right? That's a key thing, right? Then once you have that identified, communicating that to the team, right? Getting their buy-in. Do you want to see, like the example I said, the stakeholder didn't care about how many defects we found. They were just wanting to make sure what is my delivery time, right? So I told him, do you want the founder to fix it? No. I just want to know when do you get the handoff, and then when can you finish? Are you going to meet that timeline? Because I want to plan proactively of having another sweep through and then focus on clearing out the bugs. Right? It was a brand new feature. They wanted to get something out there in front of the client, get their feedback. So timing was the higher priority for them. So identifying then, talking to the stakeholders, understanding, okay, what are you really looking for? Are you looking at a granular level when the handoffs happen at a module level, at a particular feature level? What is it that you're looking for? So understanding that, identifying that, and then confirming that's exactly what we want, and then making sure people understand. Right? Then the obvious thing is, capturing it. Right? And then the leads would say, yeah, we want to make sure that we are collecting all of that, gathering that information, and then just reviewing it before we send it off and share it. Right? So capture and verify. Right? A lot of, I think people do skip over this step a little bit, the analysis and processing of that. Right? So up until this point, what I think what we do is we capture what's considered as raw data. Right? So we need to make sure we are actually analyzing that information and then being able to move that over before we share it, right? Understanding what that really represents. Because a lot of times you will have people come back and say, why'd you say, 15 defects yesterday, but today you're saying 2, right? But well, all of the others were either, pushed back, deferred, right? Or were not important, so, it's a valid defect, but we're not going to fix it, right? You could have a lot of things. So having some sort of context in that is definitely key, right? And then the other part is report on it, right? Get the feedback, revise as necessary, and then it starts again, right? So as projects go, as teams evolve, as new priorities, new business priorities are identified, you have to sort of redefine and reprioritize. So that's why I've got a sort of like iterative cycle going over there. Guys?
I have a comment about that. That's really good because I actually have done that in my past, because if you have a certain project that wants to capture, you know, these top 5 metrics, then you go on another project, they may have a different focus.
Yeah.
And definitely it's important to keep revisiting, to me, the business stakeholders, is this what you want to see? Because you don't need to pull metrics just to pull metrics. A lot of people get in that habit of just doing that to say, well, I can say that I've reported it.
Yeah.
But that may not be what they want to find out, and then you may be working harder instead of smarter because you may not need 10 metrics, you only need 5.
Exactly.
So I really like this chart. I think this is very good. I've actually been through this process personally.
And you know, a lot of, if we look back at what we would consider as our successes in projects, individually what we've done, you know, individuals testing and then giving that information, if you think back and if you have done that analysis, right, and given the insight and your take on what the issues are or the discussions relative to the needs, it's the project overall you would feel a much larger sense of accomplishment, really. Right? Because like I said, we are in the cusp where you have the IDC, you know what the business wants, and then you know what the development has done, right? So it's the perfect place to be when you want to really understand the product. Is testing. All right. So here's how I typically go on it, and I think you guys see that message pretty consistently from me. Is usually, I take standard metrics. So if you think about templates or what have you from the internet, that's usually the best cheat sheet, right? You can take that out and then customize it, right? And then add on your very generic level. That's pretty much the approach I typically take. That gives me good data out, right? And as I was saying earlier, with standard metrics, I usually look at it from a three buckets, right? You have your standards on schedule, right? So your start date, end date. You can go granular to say handoff between business to development, development to QA, whatever your particular process might be. But thinking of it in terms of schedule, right? The other one, which is usually key when you're a contractor and an external team, is the productivity, the utilization, things of that nature, right? And then overall, of course, the product quality, right? What is that perceived quality of the product that us as testers feel about it, right? Taking those standards, and again, those are pretty common. You can find a lot of them online, right? Custom metrics then is where you now take your standard metrics and you adapt that to your particular methodology, right? If you're following agile-based, Scrum-based, or if you're doing Kanban, if you're still doing waterfall, you can apply that, right? And then also you can define what sort of scope and team granularity you want to apply to it. So, for example, product quality, right, or productivity. How granular do you want to go into it? Do you want to do it at a tester level? Do you want to do it at from a product perspective? Do you want to do it at a function level, a specific area? Whatever your definition of that is relative to your project, you can apply that, right? And then, of course, your stakeholder or your client's success factor, right? It's your objectives that are driven by them, and then have that as a combination of your process and product quality. Right? So how good is your process that you've applied? And I've got an example that I'll share with you guys in a little bit about that. Any questions or comments about it so far? Is it making sense?
Yeah, that's it.
Right, so here's one example I've got of what I have used as a daily report. Right? So this is, I've got a team that's offshore in Vietnam. That used to send me data about here's what we've done, right? But that didn't have a lot of context in that project, right? So the key things that we sort of wanted to know on an ongoing basis, on a daily basis, is how many new defects have been opened up, by what severity, right? We also wanted to know from your task perspective, what's your gut about typical percent completion, right? And we defined what we meant by that. So percent complete in this was a pass, right? So whether it failed, whether it passed, doesn't matter as long as you try to execute it. What's your complete percentage rate? So we defined what that meant, right? Another thing was what was your start date on that activity, right? And what is your target end date, right? So that way it gave us a good insight of saying, if you're 1 day away and if you're, 30%, are you really sure that that 70% is so light that you can actually complete it in a day? Or are you, putting in or defining your expected percentage complete as being totally unrealistic? And then, typically give the testers an opportunity to explain what is going on and what their gut is about that particular activity. Right? So you can see you've got a bunch of notes. Yes, we are on track. The particular defect number needs to be resolved by this date, so that way we can finish on time. Whatever is open text over there to be able to communicate the importance or potential mitigation aspects of that activity. Let it sink in a little bit. Any questions on that? You guys do anything similar on this? Anybody does anything similar like this?
Yeah, but also identify if, like, for example, you have a huge project that had some large enhancements or epics, and then you want to identify, well, my client wanted to identify that there was a large number of defects against a certain specific enhancement, and then they could go research root cause. That was a big word for them.
Yes.
What was the root cause?
Yes. So root cause, actually, even while you're in the QA mode, that's when they did. Usually what I've seen is root cause plays in when you find it in production, right? That's why you want to say, hey, how could I have avoided this? But you guys actually did it while you were in QA?
Both, but yes.
Wow. It's pretty cool.
Because we were partial support too for production, so might as well nip it in the bud before it goes in.
Yeah. It's a good way of looking at it.
I know.
Yeah.
Do they still use something like function points to be able to compare different projects? Give you a give a basis of comparison, or they don't use that anymore?
I have not heard about function points in quite some time. What we have derived from it, which I think is interesting enough, is something that we call as test case points. So what we've done on that is we use the same approach of using a weight associated with the complexity of a particular test area and use that for our iterative estimations. So, the first time I do it, I can take a high-level guess of what I think is the complexity, assign it a particular scale, right? Which then translates to a point, right? So we've used that more for getting better with our estimates more than reporting. To say how many function points have been completed. We've actually stayed on saying how many stories we are going to complete or how close that epic is to finishing.
I don't ever.
Was it Mushana?
Yes. Just a Mush, yeah.
What I struggle on with this is I have probably 70 offshore QA resources. And what is a metric, first of all? And a usable metric. And do I know if my QA person's finding a lot of defects, that mean they're good? Does that mean my developer's bad? And vice versa. And then exactly my overall investment in QA from a metric standpoint isn't ultimately about finding the defects, right? And I like risk-based testing, but we really put a 64 on this risk base, and who understands it within the organization? What do you think about the overall? How do I judge the value? And then also like QA dev ratio, right? Doesn't that affect my metrics? There's so many factors to a metric. It's one of the things. Can you really understand a metric?
Very difficult situation when you try to convince people that testers should have a particular ratio to the numbers. I believe that there's no fixed or magic number for that ratio. I think typically consulting, it depends. I feel that the complexity of the component drives that ratio. You could get away with one tester testing code that's between 7 people. If it's been in production with, for the last 5 years, with only touches that they do is cosmetic, right? And that you could probably argue you don't even need a tester, right? I would differ, but I would say at least one, right? But so that makes a component. Coming back to what is a metric, right? I think the key thing there is understanding what what are you trying to track? What is your ultimate objective? Are you focused more on just the product quality, or are you also thinking you want to get your team more lean or more efficient in that context? So what are your success factors? If you establish that upfront, right, or as part of a discussion, right, then that will definitely help the test team go back and work their way down from that. I think step one is defining what you really are classifying as your success factor.
One key guideline for metrics too is to define. Often an executive mandate will come down, I want metrics in the dashboard, and the temptation is to report those metrics that are easily countable, but not the ones that really matter.
Right.
So the key is you want to find the intersection between the set of data that matters and informs good decision making, and also is objectively measurable.
Absolutely, and that varies based on the context of the project. Absolutely. Finding that, and I think from a true reporting perspective, that's the iteration that always moves on. Even if you are in the same project, your needs or your success criteria could change, right? And that's where you have to constantly look at that. Absolutely.
I find the percent complete to be
Very subjective.
yes.
Absolutely.
So if you're only testing on one platform, some tests might be 30 seconds and some might be 3 days.
Yeah.
And if you're testing on multiple platforms, we test on 8 platforms.
Wow.
If I've gotten all the way through on 3 of them,
Does it mean it's
it
30,
looks like
right?
I'm not halfway, but
Exactly.
I'm probably, those 3 are the ones that take longer because that's where you find the bugs, you have to stop and
Exactly.
write them. But it really, once I've gone through one of them, it would look like I've only done 25%,
Right.
when I've probably done 75%.
Exactly, and that's a perfect candidate where you want to actually go back and tell them this is not the right level of granularity that you want to look at.
Or if you ask the person, we're 3 days into this 10-day project, how far along are you? You probably answered 30%, you know? Who wants to look like they're behind?
Absolutely.
Or if you're ahead, who wants to admit it because you might need that time later?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so
Exactly. And it sort of comes down, you bring an excellent point where you use metrics as a gauge of how good your testing is. Right? That's the part, I think that's the mindset we should change. It's not where metrics or reporting should be a reflection of how we work. It should be a collective report card of the team. It's like, here's where we are. It's not how good I am or how bad development is. You know, and to your point, yeah, percentage is very subjective. You have to have a baseline and then be able to drive to it. And yes, I'm guilty of doing the exact same thing. I want to buffer in time. If I find a defect on the 9th day, I want to make sure I can test it again. Absolutely.
One of the points is in some of our projects we kind of reverse some of the metrics. Right? So normally you will have okay, how many test cases I'm writing. So we reverse the metric how minimum you write. But that doesn't change the goal, in terms of test strategy and all.
But see, to me, even test case counts, what value is it? It's just a number on a dashboard that may look good to an executive.
That's precisely the point.
Yeah.
By reversing it and saying that you got to write minimal, didn't change the objective. Objective was still, that forced a lot of people to kind of have the entire coverage, but most efficient.
I would actually challenge and take that even further by saying with the new techniques of exploratory or context testing, I'm assuming you guys are familiar with that sort of school of thought, but what people who perform that sort of activities, they say test cases is an artifact which is not my primary job. I'm not a tester simply by writing the test cases. I'm a tester and I'm here to test. Right? So that school of thought says, let me just make this as a simple artifact. Can I get away with documenting minimal and taking on the responsibility of being able to say, here's what all I've done, without having to explicitly spend effort to put it as a step-by-step. So that's I think, a great segue into looking at reports, right? Because if that's the approach that the team takes, where they say, okay, we are fully context-driven now, and we want charters instead of test cases, it changes reporting completely. You no longer apply to what is a test case, right? How many steps? How do you weigh that, right? And then again, what does that number really mean?
One point I was going to make is that one of my challenges for my team is that, the test cases are fine, but when you run into problems is when you get into the integration and the user acceptance testing, because it's more of a flow as opposed to a functional test. And, that's where I'm challenged. We might be looking decent as far as test case execution is concerned and percent complete, but when you get into the unit testing and integration testing, that's when you open up a whole set of issues.
So my recommendation and personal view on that is, do you actually fix that simply by reporting on it? I don't agree with that, right? Like, you would not be able to look into that simply from a reporting perspective. I would actually recommend using business workflow diagrams, right? So one of the things, and I was talking to a couple of guys here, is one of the things I've started using now is mind maps, and that's something that I'm going to talk about next week. But mind maps has been awesome. It's amazing how much information you can actually exchange between testers and developers just by whiteboarding it out.
Yes.
So to your point, here's my integration points, right? Where am I exchanging information? What are the things I need to look for? Here are my validation points, and you draw bubbles out on it or whatnot, whatever the protocols you want to set as a team, right? That does wonders. So it comes to discussion. So if you have a distributed team, right, using a tool which then you can exchange electronically versus a Word document, right? I mean, I personally have been notoriously bad with, if I see 50 pages of a document, I'm done in 3. So diagrams, diagrams help tremendously. And I use a free tool. It's called Xmind. They've got a professional paid version, but the free version does everything you want it to do, and it's got like markers and stuff. And so I use that. I would recommend trying that out. Start with a whiteboard, and then work your way up from there and see how that adopts, right? So your team can actually set a standard for it. But I think integration test can be resolved more effectively by a good strategy of validation and handoff points versus simply reporting. Right. You won't get any value out of it.
Can I just ask a general question? Is the majority, like user acceptance, is that the same team as QA? The majority of people are?
Acceptance testing?
User acceptance testing? It's more where you're looking at it as a client, as the end user, and you're actually the one that's working.
Do you control both sets of testers? So it's 2 separate people. Do you have your QA also
Yeah.
your UAT?
Well, ours works with the business, so I work with the business to work with those users. Except they're usually super users that are in the field.
You recruit them?
Yeah.
Do they use your test cases as?
That's what I like to do. I like to use our test cases, but I also want to do ad hoc testing.
So here's something I'll throw out there, slightly off topic, right? If I'm crossing the road on the exact same path over and over and over and over, how am I finding more defects? Yeah. And I would think going from QA to UAT, the goal is to find different defects, right? Yes, regression, absolutely. So you might want to consider, if they're using your test cases that people have already successfully run and passed, how much of a value is that really bringing in if you're re-executing? Just a thought.
What I'm looking when I say our test, I'm looking more critical path testing.
Okay.
Not your
okay, so it's a subset.
Function. Yeah.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah, understood. I love what you said about having them use your test cases and also doing exploratory testing.
Right.
So they can weigh in with their business SME expertise, but on the other hand, if you have some finite amount of committed content to the release,
Yeah.
you want them to use the test cases that allow them to document what data they set up as preconditions for the task, so that when they do discover a defect in UAT,
right,
they can present it to the developers in a way they can reproduce it.
And you got to think about it. It's twofold. You got users that are actually being introduced to new functionality, so that gives them the opportunity to understand how the functionality works from an application standpoint. But then when they do the ad hoc, they get more into what they do on a day-to-day basis.
and I think coming to your earlier comment earlier with really a difference between UAT or acceptance and QA, our goal as testers should be we are expert users. Right? That would be my ultimate goal, to be a really good tester and have that domain expertise in a particular application. I should be considered as a tester the best user. I know where its pitfalls are, and so really over time, that's where the domain expertise should build up.
I guess just one other thing on engaging users versus owning the UAT process internally to development. A huge advantage to the development executive in having the user do the UAT is that they're in the boat with you if there's an issue found later in production.
And there's a lot of usability things that happen, right?
Exactly. They got to sign off.
Well, yeah, the user doesn't usually use it the way the test case is written. They use it the way they use it.
Exactly.
Right. Because we delivered something that met all the specs.
Yeah.
The user just, we don't use it.
Right.
So here's
We use the tag, we don't click.
And it doesn't work. They don't use it.
I want to add on to that, just to say that's part of the tester or QA person's role, to test it and find out how the user uses it and go look outside the box.
Yeah.
And if they don't do that, then they need to be doing that.
And see, a lot
and then
of-
take what their scenarios are in the real world, incorporate that, and
Exactly.
update your test cases. That's key too.
You know, it's your point brings up a great discussion that I think at least all of us have had at least once with our developers, is if you find an issue, right, that the system doesn't behave as expected, and if it doesn't meet requirements, the easiest answer you get from development is, hey, it's not spec'd out.
Right.
What they really are trying to tell us is if the BA has not thought about it, that means that the user is not going to think about it. So
That's right.
you know, the other part that I want to throw out also is from the context-driven testing mindset. If you think about a good tester, right, and you can reflect on your own project where you've been very successful with it, is if you have executed the same test case multiple times, if you look back truly, how many times have you done exactly as the test case has walked you through? You know, a good tester will tell you, I used that as a base, but I deviated some, and I found another interesting issue. You know, so just the thought where that repeatability does become a discussion point. So slightly off topic. All right, so here's an example again that I have used in the past, and now that I look at it, I hate it. But it's a monthly again, and there's just a lot of numbers there, right? But I think this is an example where we try to change the mindset of the executive, really, of saying, you know, don't just look at numbers for the sake of looking numbers. Look at it with what value it brings, right? So this particular project was, for whatever reason, they wanted to see how many projects get done every month, right? And I guess that was sort of their SLA commitment. Zero value from a tester, right? I just need the work done and I'm good. But the reason why we had to put it in there was they established that as a success criteria for them. So it's there, and you can see it's an example of low value for us as testers, but it's out there, right? Another thing they wanted to test or look at was the delivery, right? So they had an internal milestone, and then they had a delivery date with their clients, right? So you can see how that works in. Client delivery was always 100%. And my point to them was, if you know it's always 100%, are you getting any value by just seeing it there? You know, and their basic response was, oh, our executives love seeing that. So, you know, it was that sort of mindset that you will find, and you have to work slowly at it to change, right? They had this whole thing about observations where they actually also audited the test artifacts that were delivered by the team. So they looked at how you signed off on your test cases. I mean, a compliant criteria, very, very different. But they wanted to see, you know, where you violated what their rules were and how many they considered critical versus major. They wanted to track that, right? And then these were the different project types that they had, and just seeing how many criteria they had. So just some number crunching there, but really no value from a tester. That's why I
You know one thing I found? No, sorry.
I have to disagree. There like that you completed projects, there's a warm, fuzzy feeling about it. That your report can't all be bad news, or it'll be, oh no, here comes this report again.
So
I don't want to open that email. It's gonna ruin my day.
So
We need to include things like, okay, how many stories didn't have any bugs? You know, have some things that are in there just for morale.
So I would actually counter that to say, because we didn't find it, does that mean there were no bugs?
Right, but it's still, Deb feels beat up because we found 20 bugs on this one story. But, you know, maybe there were 6 other stories that didn't have any bugs.
So the
and
average
you
is
need
really
to
low.
balance how you interact with people.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And that's a good icebreaker actually, right? To go in and
Right.
work over with the dev and pair up and test. Absolutely.
I'll stop reading your report.
My point exactly, yeah. Doesn't matter. Absolutely. So I don't know if you can see this clearly. Maybe I can switch over to a sample that I do have. Let me jump over this. Perfect. So let me open a sample out. And this is something that I think I want to just have feedback from everybody here to tell me if I'm on the right track or doesn't make sense. And this is going to be tricky because I need to make sure I look at it. So this is something that I'm just trying to work with and try to just explore at this point. But what I've done is I've sort of tried to classify reporting for team productivity, right? And as you guys know, this is probably a very touchy subject, right? It's very subjective, what does productivity, right? But here's something that I was playing with, and it sort of feeds off with what I was saying earlier, where we used a whiteboard as a snapshot. Anybody walking by could tell where we are with the project, right? So you can see what I've done is in a sense talked about functional areas or grouping of tasks, right? What my test coverage or sort of scope of it is, what is my current assessment of that item, and then just a notes criteria, right? And you can see the breakdown of what each of them means is from an effort perspective. Try to identify if I'm even going to be testing that, right? So you could have a scenario where you're in crunch mode, people have asked you to do regression, you have 4 hours, and really there's one piece of the code, a function that's not been touched, the testers, development has done a lot of unit testing, it's absolutely bullet, no issues there, right? Do we want to still test it? So from a strategy perspective, you could use your effort, right, and say, you know what, I'm not going to test it, right? So you're discussing and demonstrating and showing that risk right up front, right? So anybody walking by looking at this knows exactly what areas you're looking at, which you don't see on this, but I can tell you it's there. So that's the sort of the functional area that I'm trying to show you guys. But have it broken down by that, right? But in essence, the effort would be you have none, you have scheduled, which means you're not testing yet, but you're expecting to start, right? It's in the plan, it's going to go on, right? You've got a low effort estimate. It's going to be just, it's going to be regression, spot checks only. Yes, you're going to focus on that, right? Something that's paused, right? Even though it's testable, so you're reprioritizing it. Something else came up that you want to test. It's blocked, right? And then it's ready to ship, right? So sign off. So I've been using or thinking about using this more as an instant dashboard for anybody looking at it, right? To say, okay, here's where we are at any given time. And people assigned to any of these modules will go up there and change it as they need. And the goal being, when you're ready to ship, means everything you ship, right? Or not tested or won't be tested or like that, right? Same thing for test coverage, right? So what we're trying to say is with 0, yeah, I want to test this, right? This is a function that needs to be tested. but I have no idea, right, how to go about with it. So a stakeholder comes by and sees that and says, hey, this is something that is supposed to be, needs focused testing, right? But there's no clear information. How can I remove that roadblock, right? So this is another way of communicating that to everybody who looks at it. Right? Same thing, we've got some other variations. You're going to do a sanity check, more than a sanity check, critical functions, everything in there needs to be tested. More than that, repetitive or whatnot. And this, I think this can be driven by what is the context of your project, right? So something to keep in mind. And then the other thing with the assessment, right? So as a tester, what does it look like when you're in progress right now? You have no known problems. There might be some, but they're not blocking. You're investigating, working with development, or there are known blocking problems, right? So some sort of a gauge that sort of gives you a quick snapshot. Now what's I think different about this, right, is you notice there's no numbers. There's absolutely no numbers. But does it give you the information you want to communicate to your stakeholders, to your teams? Right? I think it does, right? But I haven't applied it enough or refined it enough to really speak about it. It's just a thought that I'm working on.
So you'd have a line for each project you're working on, and
Or,
so
so
each
this
project
could,
you
this
define
could
the
be
size.
one project within that project or within a sprint team, right? If you have just one project, what are your definition of that breakdown? It could be multiple projects as a row, but I would say actually you would probably want to be a little more granular than that, just so that way you can get a drill down look. And this is something that I sort of saw where Paul Holland, a good somebody I know in the testing community, has also done some thoughts about this also. So I like how he was going, so I'm trying to evolve that and see how we can apply it. But this essentially is reporting without numbers, right? And it's a completely different mindset. I guarantee you, if you show this to your C-level executives, they'll flip. This guy just doesn't give me anything. But once you understand what it is, it probably gives you meaningful information. What do you guys think?
It's good.
I have a question, just curious. For the effort lookup, you have low and high, but no medium. Why?
So what would medium represent? Right, I was going more by what it meant. Right, you could easily name these whatever you want. Right, if that in your project's context made sense, absolutely, I would have it in.
We have we're going for high, medium, and low, which would fall more into the test coverage piece.
Sure.
The way that we defined it.
Sure, exactly, yeah. The key thing over here that I liked was no numbers in terms of gauging what we need, right? Now, I know people use smiley faces instead of the plus, 0, and negative, but that's what you need. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions for applying weighted metrics to JIRA for QA? We have dev sprint retrospectives where they're doing planning and they use story points to assign the difficulty and the amount of time they think it's going to take to complete a particular story.
Sure.
But one JIRA is not necessarily equivalent to another as far as QA time and
Sure.
effort is concerned.
Absolutely.
Is there a good tracking method in JIRA for applying QA estimated time? How much bandwidth is it going to take to complete this ticket versus this one? This one's going to take a few days, it's going to take a couple hours.
I would have to look at the implementation, how you set that up as a tool, but I can tell you as a process, that's something that you can easily define. And what I usually have used in the past is for estimates, right? So that's the goal you want to use, right? I do have a template that I'll be happy to share with you. It's not in the tool yet. It's an Excel-based sort of estimation.
Okay.
Right, and I can definitely share that with you. You can have at it, tweak it as you need, and see if that process is something that you can actually apply within the tool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we struggled with that same thing. So what we did is the QA actually was involved in the estimation, and we could argue up, down, number 2, just as well as the developer. So it's going to hit so many things. This is going to take us this amount of time. we're going to have a medium rather than a small. So that kind of adjusted to the whole team thing for the estimation.
But then do you do a follow-up retrospective?
We have the chart, so we had 5 cars, and we had 24 points.
Sure. And do you usually have just one QA representative over there, or you have a couple of?
Whoever's available, so we have, we currently have 3 QAs for 10 developers.
Yeah.
So
I
we don't break it down to the developer versus QA.
Sure.
The points are just per the sprint.
Right. So what I would recommend is in those situations where you want to get better forecasting, right, or estimation, right, is have more than one person in there, so that way if they are way off, right, then it becomes a discussion of why are you thinking 1 versus 7.
It's usually the whole team's in there for we do the retro and then we do the next iteration planning.
Yeah. So in the retrospective though, is there any discussion about, when you said this was 5 points, did it turn out to be 5 or was it 7?
We started to do that, but then we would like to.
Because that would be the key to sort of identifying that, right? Yeah. I'll show you what I mean by that. Because here's what I try to track, right? So this is a slightly different variation, right? Where it sort of talks to what you're talking about, but if you see what I've got here is trying to identify your variance, right? And the way I collect it, so this is sort of like a pivot on some raw data, right? And the raw data that I try to collect is in this context, right? So your planned activity, comparing that to actual, right? And then seeing what your variances are, right? And this sort of comes into how I want to try to tackle building team efficiencies. And we'll be running out of time.
I just want to make one point about that. When you look at that plan in action, do you take into consideration if there's any change in scope?
Yes, if there are variations, then you got to go back and refine this. Absolutely, absolutely. You cannot have it. Now, if you wanted to really track how many times you encounter that for team process efficiencies, you can track that as a separate entity, as a counter or whatever, right? And have weights associated or whatnot, right? Depending on what you want to track on it. But really, what I'm trying to say here is, if you were to try from an efficiency perspective, track your planned efforts and things of that nature, right? But what is interesting is we want to also start tracking about each activity, what was the tool you used, and how much of a manual effort was involved in using that tool, right? So in this example, we were building these test strategies, right? So we were doing mind maps and drawing images out, right? Yes, that we're using a tool for it, right? So it's an electronic format, but what you do on it is still manual effort, right? So that's why I said, okay, it's 100% manual effort, right? So in hindsight, you can actually define or decide whether is that something that is worth to continue, or can you live without that, right? Or you could look at it and say, hey, I'm using some sort of a framework that is still 80% manual, right? How can I get that done faster? Is there a better way to increase my efficiency in doing that, right? So if you're using Excel, would I get it done faster if I had a macro built up, right? Should I invest in that? Because if I'm seeing, every project is doing that work, to get the numbers out, I'm still doing a lot of it manually and spending X number of hours. Can I reduce that effort down?
So is this something, are you willing to share with us?
Sure, yeah.
So if you want to send that to me like in a PDF,
Okay.
and I'll put it as a link on our website with the presentation.
Sure, absolutely.
Is that helpful? Yeah.
And the dashboard one too.
Outside of the presentation?
Yeah, that
Oh, wait, it was
dashboard
in the
got it.
presentation.
It was in
It's
it,
already-
yeah.
Okay, so that's already in there.
Okay.
Okay, we have one more
No, it
question,
was
I'm
out.
sorry, we have to wrap up.
It was
We have
out.
to be out of the room.
The spreadsheet, if the spreadsheet, if you'd be willing to provide a copy of the spreadsheet, if that could not be PDF, but actually Excel, because it looks like there's actually some.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried to.
Well, since it's his, I want to protect the fact that he authored it. That was the purpose of that. We don't post anything that's not PDF for a reason. So, because we didn't author the document,
But
in
we
fairness.
can share information with you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's just something we have to do.
Sure.
We have one more question? Are we good? Thank you. Excellent.